Moving on to Chapter 14 now, we're going to discuss some disorders in immunity. So follow your learning objectives / study guide for Chapter 14 pretty carefully because due to time constraints here at the end of the semester, we're not going to be able to cover everything in the chapter. We're going to wind up hitting some highlights here. All right, so for the first video lecture for Chapter 14, we're going to talk about an introduction to immunopathology, so that's diseases that are associated with immune system problems. And then we're going to focus in on something called type 1 hypersensitivity, which you know better as the kind of everyday allergies that you experience. All right, so immunopathology, so diseases of the immune system. These can be either hyposensitivities or hypersensitivity. So hyposensitivity means you have an immunodeficiency. Your immune system is not functioning properly. Okay, and that can be primary. So patients who have a primary immunodeficiency are born with a genetic defect or defects that compromises their immune system, and so they very often have, there are different types, so some can be fairly mild, or they can be extremely severe where you have essentially almost no functioning immune system and almost no ability to fight off infections. And then a secondary immunodeficiency would be something like if you had HIV. You were infected with that virus, it kills your helper T cells, and you lose the ability to, the helper T cells are kind of the grand conductors of your immune system. Then you wind up not being able to mount a very good response against all kinds of microorganisms that you get exposed to. Born with this, you develop this later. Hypersensitivities, this is where your immune system is reacting or overreacting in an inappropriate way, and those can be divided up into 4 types. And we'll briefly talk about types 2, 3, and 4. We're mainly going to focus in on type 1 hypersensitivity. And this is also called immediate hypersensitivity and includes things like what you think about as typical common allergies to a more severe scale where you can experience anaphylaxis, like if you are severely allergic to bee venom or peanuts or things like that, you can actually have a systemic type 1 reaction across the entire body at one time, and that's called anaphylaxis. All right, so again, we're going to focus in on hypersensitivity first. So this is where you're having an overreaction or inappropriate reaction of the immune system. And it's divided up into 4 different categories. And one is called immediate hypersensitivity, anaphylaxis, and allergies, and we'll talk about how that works. This is based around IgE. Remember that class of antibodies? I mentioned that a few lecture clips ago, that we would be returning to IgE. IgE type antibodies are the ones that are involved in triggering this. Type 2 also involves antibodies, but they're IgG and IgM, and they attach to things inappropriately. And we also talked about how those antibodies attract in the complement proteins and trigger complement and membrane attack complexes to form in the things that those antibodies attach to. So this is a type of hypersensitivity where you are inappropriately making IgG and IgM antibodies to something, and it triggers the complement system to come in and get involved. Type 3 involves immune complexes. So complexes between antibodies and antigens clumping together and agglutinating and forming these complexes that get deposited in your body and then trigger inflammation because of that. And a good example of that is lupus. The official name for lupus is systemic lupus erythematosus, but if you know somebody who has that, they're experiencing a type 3 hypersensitivity problem. And then finally type 4, so you know, these other 3 types are really antibody or triggered by antibody problems. This is a T cell problem. So you have cytotoxic T cells that wind up attacking something inappropriately or at too high of a level, and that causes problems for you. So some examples with these type 1, the familiar types of seasonal allergies and so forth, or if you have a food allergy. Now type 2 is actually involved in a blood transfusion reaction. So if you have type A blood and you were accidentally transfused with type B, you would experience a type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. Type 3, I mentioned lupus is an example of that, rheumatoid arthritis is an example of that. And then type 4, if you've ever experienced poison ivy or any type of contact dermatitis, like maybe you have a metal allergy, something like that, that involves cytotoxic T cells causing problems for you. Or notice over here on this table, another example would be a graft rejection or an organ transplant rejection. That involves cytotoxic T cells swarming in and attacking those grafted or transplanted tissues. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about type 1 allergic reactions and how those develop. So an allergy, again, is some sort of an exaggerated immune response to something, and it triggers inappropriate inflammation, which can be anywhere from mild to extremely severe, depending on where it's happening and how strong it is. It's triggered by antigens that you get exposed to, but antigens that trigger type 1 allergic reactions can also be known as allergens. It's like there are molecules on pollen grains and so forth that function as allergens in some types of people. There's another term, atopy. If you have a local allergy, like something like hay fever, because you're inhaling in pollen and things like that, so it's just happening, say, in the upper respiratory tract, that's an example of atopy. Anaphylaxis is where you have a widespread allergic reaction across the entire body all at the same time. So that's systemic and potentially deadly, because this is another case where you have inflammation going on across your entire body all at one time. And remember what that does to your blood vessels. Your blood vessels dilate, and when your blood vessels dilate across your entire body all at the same time, that can be deadly because your blood pressure is going to drop to dangerously low levels. Okay, so let's talk about atopy, little local allergies that we experience. So there's a figure from your textbook, which is pretty good because it is showing you some different things that different people experience type 1 allergies to. So all kinds of things. Dust mites, lots of people are allergic to these little microscopic dust mites that we get exposed to. Pollen, everybody knows that people are allergic to pollen. Bee venom, penicillin, lots of people have type 1 allergic reactions to penicillin. Red dye, maybe you've heard of people being allergic to red food coloring. Peanuts, shrimp, strawberries, latex gloves. Probably somebody watching this video clip is allergic to latex gloves. So these are things that vary from person to person. All right, why? We still don't exactly know why different people develop allergies to different things. There's some evidence that it's at least partially genetic, but, or actually I guess the current school of thinking is that the tendency to develop allergies is genetic, but not necessarily the things that you are allergic to. So like person A has a baby and person A may get lots of allergies. The baby may get lots of allergies, but maybe they aren't allergic to the exact same things. There is this hygiene hypothesis. Remember, I linked a video clip to this back in chapter 11. You know, why do it turns out that people who live in countries with good hygiene, like the United States and Japan and over in Europe and other parts of the world as well, that are wealthier nations, you have good sanitation, good hygiene, those populations of people tend to develop more of these types of allergies. And so people are wondering why that is. And it may get into what we discussed earlier back in chapter 12 with your normal microbiota, and in chapter 11 as well, how there's this school of thought that we need to have a healthy, robust set of microorganisms living on and inside our bodies to properly train your immune system to keep it kind of dialed back and focused on pathogens and not your normal microbes. The hygiene hypothesis that's been around for at least 20 years says that maybe with all these hygienic practices we're screwing up our normal microbiota population. And maybe we're eliminating some species that actually need to be there. And maybe some of those species are really important for keeping your immune system focused on fighting off the foreign things that could harm you. And when that happens, then that might be the thing that sort of triggers the immune system to start overreacting to other things like this and causing problems for us. It's almost like your immune system doesn't have, it's almost like your normal microbes maybe kind of just keep the immune system dialed back and under control, because they have to survive on and inside our bodies as well. They have to establish this relationship that allows them to remain in place in our bodies without getting completely wiped out. So they have some way of kind of dialing back the immune system. And so if you wipe out your normal microbes, or a lot of them, through excessive hygiene or taking antibiotic drugs frequently and so forth, maybe that the immune system is not getting dialed back enough and it's causing it to turn inward on our own cells and tissues, or it'll begin to react to everyday things we get exposed to, like peanuts and pollen and so forth and so on. All right, so how do these type 1 allergies develop? Okay, the first thing that has to happen is sensitization. So this is what happens the first time you get exposed to something you're going to wind up being allergic to. This is called sensitization. So what we're seeing here is, this is supposed to be a mucous membrane, and in comes whatever it is you're going to be allergic to. Maybe these are some pollen antigens. And those pollen antigens get into the lymphatic vessels and travel to a lymph node. And then in there, you wind up stimulating helper T cells and B cells. Okay? Just like we discussed back in chapter 13. T cells get stimulated to this allergen. B cells get stimulated to the allergen. Helper T cell helps out the B cell. B cell divides over and over and over again, becomes plasma cells that are secreting antibodies. All right, so we talked about the different classes of antibodies that could be generated that will attach to an antigen. So you have IgG and M and D and A and E. So the IgE class, these are the ones that are involved in allergies. So when people develop allergies to something, type 1 allergies, it's because they are making an inappropriate amount of these IgE antibodies against that substance. And so for some reason, in some people, their plasma cells crank out these IgE antibodies instead of some other class. Now what happens is these IgE antibodies, their stems, the little stem portions, those can dock onto mast cells and also onto basophils. And remember, those are the cell types that are involved in triggering inflammation. So basically you have mast cells and or basophils that become coated with these IgE antibodies, and so the next time you get exposed to the allergen, that allergen comes in and it attaches to those antibodies, and when that happens, it causes the mast cells to degranulate. Same thing with basophils if they're present. They degranulate, which means they release all the chemicals they've got stored up in those membrane-covered granules, and it triggers inflammation. So mast cells and basophils will release things like histamine and serotonin and bradykinin and prostaglandins and leukotrienes. There's a whole gamish of chemical signaling molecules that are involved in triggering inflammation. All right, and so it's all those chemical signaling molecules that ultimately will lead to the symptoms that you associate with allergies. And sometimes it's very local. Sometimes it's across a wider area or even systemic in the case of anaphylaxis. But so some of those, this is a pretty good diagram from your textbook because it's showing you, some of these chemicals that get released out of mast cells, what do they do? So for example, prostaglandins get released from mast cells, and those help out with the vasodilation of inflammation. And notice it also constricts your bronchioles in your lungs. So that's why if you have a respiratory allergy, you can have trouble breathing. Let's say you've got asthma, something like that. That's this type of allergy as well, because your bronchioles in your lungs will actually constrict, and then you don't have the type of airflow that you really need. Prostaglandins are also involved in pain signaling. Remember, we've talked about that before. So it could lead to headache. Leukotrienes are are molecules that can be involved in constriction of bronchioles as well. You've got an asthma patient over here who's having to use an inhaler to try to dilate those bronchioles. And also mucus buildup can be stimulated. Mucus production is stimulated when you have inflammation going on as well. Then histamine, serotonin, bradykinins, these are other chemicals. We've talked about how histamines cause blood vessel dilations. Increased peristalsis in your intestinal tract. Those are the muscle contractions that propel food through the digestive tract. Vomiting, depending on where an allergic reaction is happening, you can experience those types of symptoms as well. Excessive secretion of mucus and so forth along epithelial lining. So these are all things that can happen during an allergic reaction. Is because of all those chemicals that are released out of those mast cells and or basophils that might be present. Interesting also, another little aside with allergies, IgE antibodies are the main antibodies that are supposed to attach to parasitic worms. And so, there's a school of thought that when we have allergies to something, it's because your immune system for some reason has misinterpreted the pollen or the peanut allergens or whatever that you've been exposed to. It's misinterpreted those as antigens of parasitic worms. And so you're generating these antibodies that are supposed to help you fight off parasitic worms, but instead they're directed toward whatever it is you're allergic to. So that's another school of thought out there about why a lot of us develop allergies to things. Some various allergic conditions, hay fever, that's where you're sneezing and so forth, due to an allergic reaction up in the upper respiratory tract. Asthma. The big problem with asthma is that bronchoconstriction, which can be fatal in some people if it's severe enough. When you have an allergic reaction, it might seem counterintuitive, but the airway is closing off, and probably the idea there is if you're inhaling something that's toxic, you're limiting the ability of whatever that is that's toxic to spread down into the lungs. But when that's happening through an allergic reaction, it can be bad news because it's cutting off your air supply. If you know somebody who has eczema, that's a atopic dermatitis. So this is local allergy. This is inflammation along the skin. Food allergies of various types, drug allergies all fall in this category. As I mentioned earlier, systemic anaphylaxis, this occurs when you have an allergic reaction across the entire body. So like let's say you are severely allergic to fire ant venom. When a fire ant bites you, that venom gets into your bloodstream, so it travels all throughout the entire body, which means once you start generating these antibodies, you can have mast cells and so forth that are sensitized, have those little IgE antibodies docking on them, throughout the entire body. So when you get exposed to this fire ant, I guess that's really where your problem is. When you get exposed to the fire ant venom again, that venom is going to spread throughout your entire body, and it's going to dock on these mast cells, and they're going to degranulate across your entire body at once. And instead of an allergy just occurring like up here if you were inhaling something, that fire ant venom's going everywhere. So it's going to trigger an allergic reaction across your entire body all at once. And again, when you have that widespread vasodilation, that leads to hypotension, low blood pressure, and that can be deadly. Severe bronchoconstriction can be harmful or deadly. So in a case of systemic anaphylaxis, that can actually be fatal within about 15 minutes if it's not treated. This is kind of like what we've talked about with bacterial endotoxin, although it can be even more severe than that. And some other symptoms, development of hives on the skin. The tongue can actually swell due to inflammation occurring there. And then the swelling and the constriction of the throat tissues. Bad news when you've got this occurring all across your entire body all at one time. Here's a little interesting thing. What about allergy shots? When people get allergy shots, the idea there is you're trying to desensitize someone. And again, the problem with allergies is the people who have allergies, they have generated these IgE antibodies that then dock on and sit there and wait on the mast cells for you to get exposed to that allergen again another time. So what they're trying to do with desensitization, they deliberately inject you with things that you're allergic to, the allergens. And what they're trying to do, whatever procedure they're using and the location of delivery, you know, shooting that into a muscle somewhere, they're trying to trigger you to make IgG antibodies instead. And so then the idea is, if this is something you're allergic to, your IgG antibodies, those float around in your body fluids. Try to get those to intercept the allergens, dock onto the allergens, before those allergens have the opportunity to attach to those IgE antibodies that are sitting there on your mast cells or your basophils, or the eosinophils also get coated with them. So it's kind of an interception type thing. Let's have the patients make a different kind of antibody and have those IgG antibodies intercept these allergens before they can cause those mast cells or basophils to undergo degranulation. So apparently for things that you inhale, this type of desensitization is about 65 to 70% effective. But for things like insect venoms, it's about 97% effective. So if you do have a child who's allergic to something like bee venom or fire ant venom, it's probably a very good idea to try to have them desensitized with allergy shots. It can help limit their risk for experiencing systemic anaphylaxis. Of course, you got to keep having them. You know, you got to keep going back and getting more allergy shots so that you keep producing those IgG antibodies. Don't last forever. So if you want to stay desensitized, you've got to keep going back and getting those shots so you keep producing those IgGs that can intercept those allergens for you. All right, so that was just kind of an overview of type 1 allergic reactions. In the next video lecture, we're going to hit some highlights on the other 3 types of hypersensitivity, type 2, 3, and 4. We're not going to go into as much detail, though, as we did with the first type.